Okay, here we go. This is chapter 36 and 37. So after the war, after World War II, the key aspect of the post-war slides are what happened to the United States and what happened to Germany and Japan and Britain and Russia, the other countries that fought in World War II. So as far as the Germans and the Japanese people who perpetrated the Holocaust and the aggression of World War II, there were trials. So in Nuremberg, the Nazis were put on trial, and in Japan, the various Japanese generals were put on trial. And the key thing to learn about that is that governments and individuals can be held accountable for their war crimes and atrocities. So it's not okay for them to say, well, they were just following orders from Hitler, so it's not their fault. Or they're just following orders from Tojo, the leader of Japan, it's not their fault. That doesn't work. Okay? People who do terrible war crimes like the Holocaust are held accountable after the war. In terms of in the United States, after World War II began this fear of communism and also this sense of what do we do now? So in terms of the fear of communism, these things here, the Taft-Hartley Act, the National Security Act. The Taft-Hartley Act was a law that allowed the government basically to spy on unions and prevent unions from striking. Because unions were associated with communism. The idea is that unions and communism were very similar. So the government, the Republicans in Congress were wanting to keep an eye on that. However, President Truman was against that law, the Taft-Hartley Act. He vetoed it, but the Republicans in Congress overrid that veto, which means that it became law anyway. The GI Bill is important. The GI Bill provided something for the veterans who are coming back from World War II to do, namely go to school and have housing. The GI Bill was a great way to give the returning soldiers a new life after the war that would benefit the country as well. It had a profound effect on the lives of those GIs because going to college, going back to school, having a house in the suburbs changed their whole life from what they had left before. And always remember that after a war, Americans want peace and quiet. Okay, Americans don't tend to like to be involved in wars for obvious reasons. Okay, there was a huge economic boom in the United States after World War II, mostly because of the fact that the U.S. was not hurt in World War II, the actual country, and a lot of countries were. And so the U.S. participated in rebuilding those countries and in building itself up with all that money. So money was just flowing after World War II in the 1950s. People started to move around in the United States. The idea of moving down south to the warmer, sunnier parts of the United States, in California, Florida, Texas especially, became popular, and it became easier because of the interstate highways, which were built by President Eisenhower, originally for military purposes, so that there would be a network of roads to move military equipment around the country, but it also moved goods and people around the country much, much easier, especially with newer, more modern cars that traveled at faster speeds and safer on the highway. It really started to change America a lot, the highway system. There was a huge baby boom, of course, after World War II, all those young men coming back, ready to start their lives, and back then, having babies was like, that's what you did when you hit your 20s, you had babies, and they had many of them for the time period. They also treated them better than ever before because there were these new psychological advances that the way you raise your child will have a huge effect on their adult life. In the past, people didn't always think about that. So things like Dr. Spock's baby and child care book were popular, products for kids, because there were a lot of kids and there was a lot of money and people wanted to spend money on their kids. So companies made crap for kids. We talked about the teenage culture. As the kids got older, companies still wanted to sell them stuff, and kids stayed kids longer. No longer were you 14, 15 going out and working in farms and maybe having kids, as it used to be in the 1800s even. Today, or in the 1950s, this whole idea of teenagers developed. These kids who were not little kids anymore, who were interested in adultish things like music and going out to eat and movies and dating and all this crap. that cost money. And the whole thing was like, what can we sell these teenagers to make money? Back to the Cold War. So the Cold War starts pretty quick after World War II. Towards the end of World War II, the three most powerful nations in the world, the British, the United States, and the Russians met, and they divided up the world and decided who would control what. Germany was divided between the Western powers, the US, France, and Britain, which were like democracies, and then the Soviet Union took the eastern part of Germany. And there was just a lot of creation of lines around the world that were going to be controlled by Russia and what was going to be controlled by the United States. The USSR, of course, was very badly hurt in World War II, lost millions and millions of people. They wanted a protection zone around their country so that no one could ever attack them again. The U.S. saw that, however, as potentially aggressive. The Russians could move out of that protection zone into other countries. The U.S. decided that it was important to help the former countries that were destroyed in World War II, mostly because those countries, if they didn't get help from the United States, might try to get it from Russia or some other place. And so the United States, through the Marshall Plan, gave a lot of support to Britain, Germany, France, Italy, to rebuild those countries and make them good again so that they would stay democracies and loyal to the United States and not fall into communism. The Berlin Airlift is an example. West Berlin was completely surrounded by East Germany. West Berlin was a democracy, part of West Germany, and the Russians cut it off. The Russians and the East Germans worked together. They cut off West Berlin from getting food and supplies, so the United States dropped food from the air, giving the people support, and we showed the Russians that we were not going to back down in Germany. So the Cold War starts, like this has a number of things I just mentioned. Remember the idea of containment? That became Truman's, like the Truman Doctrine was all about containment. Keep communism in where it is and don't let it grow. Rather than trying to attack the Soviet Union, we would simply prevent them from gaining more power in other countries. The United Nations, this idea of all the world's countries working together to solve the problems of the world came into being and was centered here in the United States. Truman desegregated the military. Part of that was the idea that the United States needed to be as strong as possible, and having African Americans and whites separated in the military wasn't making us as strong as we could be. Containment, we just talked about the Iron Curtain. We've talked about before. Well, we've talked about everything before, but I think those are fairly simple. NATO is another part of America's strategy to counter the Soviet Union. NATO is a collective security organization. All these countries are in NATO, and if any one of them are attacked by Russia specifically or any other country, the U.S. would defend them, and we would defend each other. All these countries are in total bond with each other, and one is attacked, everybody defends that country. So the Soviet Union had their own. They called it the Warsaw Pact. It was much smaller and weaker, but these two alliances stood off against each other, and it kind of shows you how far the U.S. got from staying in its own business. I mean, now after World War II, we joined the United Nations, we joined NATO, we take leadership around the world. Before World War II, and especially before World War I, the U.S. was not interested in being the world's teacher, the world's boss, the world's policeman. We wanted to stick to our own business. But after World War II, we definitely did not. China became communist. We talked about that. Harry Truman tried to continue these deals. His first boss, FDR, had the New Deal, so he came up with the Fair Deal. The Fair Deal was just a continuation of the New Deal, really. It was a bunch of programs to help grow the economy and make things more prosperous for everyone. McCarthyism is super important. McCarthy was a member of Congress who was obsessed with the idea that communism was coming into the United States. It was spreading. There were people in the government who were communists and we didn't even know. He had all these investigations, wanted people to snitch on all their friends. It was a big hysteria in the country. People believed that communists were everywhere. And the reality is that probably wasn't true. And it kind of got out of control. People realized that he was accusing innocent people of being communists, that being a communist didn't necessarily mean you were a bad person, that it was violating freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and eventually McCarthy was shut down. But not until all these terrible things happened. For example, the Rosenbergs were executed for spying. A lot of people were thrown in jail. There were lots of pointless investigations. Between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So the U-2 spy plane, there's a lot of spying back and forth. The U-2 spy plane was a plane that flew really, really high, got shot down over Russia. It turns out it was an American plane. That proved that we were spying on them. That pissed them off. Of course, they already knew that. It was just all a big game. The Hungarian uprising in Hungary, which bordered the Warsaw Pact, bordered communist countries, they tried to rise up and be a democracy, and the Russians sent tanks and crushed them, and the U.S. did nothing, which a lot of criticism went towards the government of the United States for not helping the Hungarians. The Eisenhower Doctrine has to do with not letting the Russians get too powerful in the Middle East, where our oil came from. Domino theory is on the next slide. I'll talk about that in a minute. Of course, the space race was important. The Russians were the first to launch a ship into space, Sputnik, a little satellite that just beeped, but it scared Americans to death and caused us to really focus on math and science in schools and improving our education system so we could compete with the Russians, who were perceived as having a better education system. Sputnik was the very first thing that was ever launched into space. During the Eisenhower era, we've already talked about some of these things. In the United States, during the 1950s, the economy was good. White people moved out to the cities. They got cars, which were being promoted like crazy out of Detroit. They drove the cars to the suburbs where they bought cheap houses, had little yards, got dogs, had a place for their kids to run around, super nice in their mind, promoted by realtors. So white people leave the cities start to fall apart when the government and the people stop spending money on the cities, and a lot of urban ghettos emerge where basically no more money is put into the apartment buildings and the houses in the city, and a lot of cities become filled with minorities, and it becomes very, very segregated. And that still exists today, of course. The highway helped make that happen. Baby boom, we already talked about. All right, in 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States decided in Brown versus Board of Education that separate schools were not equal. Separate but equal, the doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson, was overturned. That idea that something, the white and black race, could be separate and everything would just have to be equal was BS. This court basically said separate is never equal, because the reality is the white stuff was always better than the black stuff. Better schools, better drinking fountains, everything. And so it knocked down Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown and set the path towards the end of Jim Crow in the country. Korean War is part of the Cold War, of course. The north of Korea was communist, the south was not. The U.S. helped the south, tried to take over, kick the north communists out. Nobody won. The war is still basically not happening, but the two sides are not at peace. They're just staring each other down in Korea. The north remains communist, the south remains democratic, and they just stare at each other and occasionally shoot at each other and spy on each other, and it's a bad situation. Yeah, I talked about that. Nope. All right, that's it for those slides. Let's go to 38 and 39. So the 1960s. The 1960s started off so happy and so good. We had a young, cool president, JFK, youngest president ever, and a pretty wife and kids. He was barely elected. A lot of people didn't like him because he was Catholic. He was very northern, from Boston, regarded as, by many of the older people, as just too young. However, he was super popular with younger people. He had this whole idea of going to space, of the Peace Corps. Going to space is the New Frontier program, very much about the Cold War. Kennedy's idea that the U.S. needed to go to the moon had little to do with any need for us to be on the moon. There was no real purpose to be on the moon. It was just to show the Russians we were better than them. And the same thing with the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps supposedly was for Americans to go around the world and help poor countries. And it did do that, but it also established some imperialism, some not control, but influence over those poor countries so that they wouldn't become communist. Cuba was the big event of the JFK presidency. The Russians, of course, secretly were putting nuclear missiles in Cuba, and we wanted that. We found out about it from spying on Cuba, flying planes over Cuba, seeing the missiles, telling the Russians that they needed to take the missiles out, and we were going to block Cuba off from any Russian ships with a military, a naval blockade on the ocean. The Russians sailed anyway towards Cuba. There was a showdown in the Atlantic, and the story goes that the Russians backed down. They took the missiles out of Cuba and went home. Of course, we also know that that caused the U.S., it was a sort of a secret deal, to take some missiles out of Turkey, which were near the Russians themselves. 25th Amendment was passed during this. 25th Amendment just says who gets to be president if the president and the vice president die. Like, what happens if there's a nuclear attack? Who becomes the president? That's presidential succession. You don't need to know the details. Berlin Wall, of course, goes up. The West and East Berlin just can't exist in any way together. They have to be separate. East Germans are trying to leave and go to West Germany and stay there, and the East Germans have to build a wall to keep them in. And that becomes a symbol of the Cold War. As long as Berlin is divided, the Cold War is still happening, at least after World War II. NASA, we talked about. The Peace Corps, we talked about. All right, civil rights movement really started in earnest with the Brown versus Board of Education. The people who sued the NAACP and lawyers to end segregation in schools always intended to end segregation everywhere in the country. It led up to the 1964, 10 years later, Civil Rights Act. So between 54 and 64, those 10 years were the big years of the civil rights movement. They went from Jim Crow being in effect to Jim Crow totally dead. And so the Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation in schools. Civil Rights Act in 1964 ended segregation everywhere. Every public accommodation. So any business like a restaurant or a hotel that's open to provide a service to people could not discriminate on the basis of race. And that's a very important act. The Voting Rights Act, of course, a year later, knocked down all those barriers to voting that had been established by Jim Crow for black people down south. The 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. You don't have to pay to vote. It's free. The NAACP, CORE, SCLC, Nation of Islam are all different organizations for civil rights that worked in different ways to accomplish their goals. So the NAACP sued people. CORE did a lot of protesting. SCLC was the churches working together, did a lot of the nonviolent protesting, and a lot of the boycotts and things like that. Nation of Islam was more centered in the north and a little bit more aggressive, wanting change sooner and not wanting to wait. And that was symbolized with Dr. King and Malcolm X. Of course, Dr. King absolutely tied to nonviolent protest, civil disobedience, and Malcolm X not being violent, but being more willing to use self-defense against aggression by whites and being more in favor of total separation from white people. He later kind of changed that, but neither of the two gentlemen lived long enough to fully realize their potential because they were killed, of course, by assassins. A number of other groups were inspired by the civil rights movement of African Americans, including the Latinos in the West, Cesar Chavez, organizing migrant workers into unions to have proper pay and working conditions in California. Ignacio Lopez, similar, except he was more about organizing Latino voting power in California. A lot of the Latino things were focused in California and New York City. The California is more, for some reason, on the regions than the New York City. I don't know why. American Indian movement. American Indians still trying to get treated equally and fairly. Not very successful at that. Women, Betty Friedan and Phyllis Schlafly are sort of opposite. Betty Friedan reignited the women's rights movement, said, hey, yeah, we can vote, but we're still treated like second-class citizens in our own country. Women are kept out of a lot of jobs, paid less than men. A lot of things are set up for men only, including most of the government, with women being excluded. Phyllis Schlafly was much more traditional and felt that we should not change too quick in the relations between men and women, very traditional. Equal Rights Amendment was a proposal to add to the Constitution an amendment for equal rights for women, basically outlined discrimination on the basis of sex. It never became part of the Constitution. Equal pay for equal work, the Equal Opportunity Employment Act, employers must pay women the same as men for the same work, still isn't really happening today. National Organization of Women, talked about women's pro-rights, obvious, it's kind of a pro-abortion or pro-choice organization too. Title IX is a law that said any educational institution, like colleges or schools that get money from the government, cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, particularly in sports programs. Affirmative action programs try to take affirmative action, actual action to address discrimination and racism, rather than waiting for it to like slowly go away over time. So for example, giving preference, making sure that schools are diverse, colleges, jobs, so that it doesn't just happen to be all white. Like in the past, that was what occurred. This would like try to make sure that minorities were included because we're stronger when we're more diverse. Gaudelet University about deaf people's was never on there. The education of handicapped children. The idea is least restrictive environment. Kids cannot be locked in closets and kept totally separate just because of some kind of disability. Same thing with any human being in America with any physical or mental disability. They cannot be segregated out or prevented from working if there's some reasonable accommodation that will permit them to work in a particular job. All these court cases, oh my goodness, time is short. It's going to be really fast. Baker versus Carr, one person, one vote. That means that when you're drawing like voting districts, they have to be relatively equal in terms of numbers of people, not geography. Doesn't matter how big it is, it matters how many people are there. So every little group has the same voting power. Engel versus Vitale, schools cannot sponsor or force prayer. It's okay to pray in school, but the school can't in any way require it or make people feel uncomfortable if they don't participate. Escobedo, you have a right to a lawyer if you're being interrogated by the police. Even if you're not under arrest, if they're questioning you about a crime, you have a right to an attorney. Roe v. Wade, you have a right to privacy in your body, which has been interpreted as meaning abortion cannot be outlawed because a woman's body is her body, and the government cannot intrude to the point of outlawing abortion entirely, although that's very controversial. University of California versus Bakke, affirmative action is okay to admit kids or anybody into college, but there can't be quotas. You can't like require there be a certain number of people or prevent people from coming solely because of their race. But it is okay to take race and ethnicity into consideration. New Jersey versus TLO, kids do not leave their rights at the schoolhouse door. When you come to school, you have freedom of speech, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. The school can search kids, the school can limit speech, but only with what's reasonable for educational purposes, not to discriminate or harass. JFK was killed, we know that, poor guy. Great Society was a bunch of programs designed by the replacement of President Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, to really target poverty. Poverty in the country was getting out of control. Many people would say it still is. And these programs like Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid, Job Corps, food stamps, etc., all target poverty and try to end poverty in America and help poor people. These programs were possible because the Democrats controlled the White House and the Congress and were able to just get through a whole lot of laws that helped people. However, they're also very expensive and caused the government to get very big and broke. Same slide. Vietnam, so I'm not going to go too much detail on Vietnam. Vietnam was becoming communist, the northern part, the southern part wasn't. Pursuant to the domino theory, the idea that if Vietnam or any country becomes communist, the countries around it will soon become communist as it spreads. And so we needed to stop Vietnam from being communist, simply to prevent it from spreading. That's sort of the same idea as containment. The war was very unpopular because the U.S., there was never a declaration of war. We didn't really debate should it happen or not. Presidents just kept sending soldiers, sending soldiers, sending soldiers, leading to the passage of the War Powers Act, which said that if the president sends military troops to another country, he needs to inform the Congress within 48 hours about what he's doing and why he's sending them and when that will end and how many and what the conditions are. the president cannot simply start a giant war and not tell the Congress or work with the Congress. That's a major point of that war. It also shows how hard it is for the U.S. to fight a war when that war is not popular. Vietnam, people weren't buying the domino theory, that we needed to die, and that's the only way, is to have 50-some thousand Americans killed fighting this idea of dominoes or whatever. Americans were not having it. All right, 39, I won't get very far, but President Johnson does not want to run. 1968, Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, the brother of JFK, gets shot, killed. He was supposed to become a Democratic nominee for president. Same thing, Martin Luther King. Same thing, Malcolm X. It was a very violent, bloody year, and a lot of people died, and it made the country just feel like things were falling apart. So they voted for someone safe. Richard Nixon, the former vice president under Eisenhower, was regarded as a safe option, and so he wins. He had to deal with a crappy economy in the 1970s. Inflation was going up. The prices of everything was rising. But the amount of money people were making in the economy was not. So it was hard to keep up. President Nixon made the war worse in Vietnam. First, he tried to Vietnamese it, basically have Vietnam itself, South Vietnam, fight the war on its own, supposedly with U.S. help. But it did not work. And the U.S. just got more and more involved. He invaded Cambodia right next to Vietnam for some reason, thinking that he could just. Nixon became obsessed with winning the war and dumped just all this money and soldiers into it, and it just got Americans more and more angry, and it was a bad move. So Nixon was also very secretive. He tried to keep secrets about the war from the press. The New York Times versus United States. The New York Times sued the United States, sued President Nixon basically, because he would not turn over secret papers about Vietnam. That basically showed he lied about a lot of stuff in the war. He lost, and those papers were put out there, which showed what a dirtbag Nixon was. He did do some good things. He was very smart. He relaxed tensions, détente. That's when you relax tensions with a former enemy and you try to get along with them. He did that with Russia and China, mostly to try to get them to not have any kind of relationship with each other and instead worry about how good they were getting along with the United States. And it was good because it did lower the number of weapons in nuclear weapons. There was the SALT agreement. The SALT agreements were agreements between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. OPEC I'll talk about. You'll have to ask me. It's about oil. Détente, we talked about it. Détente. All right, these cases I have not taught very much. Griswold versus Connecticut. States cannot make contraception illegal. Condoms and the pill must be legal. They didn't used to be because of the right to privacy. That came before Roe v. Wade. I already talked about Engel versus Vitale. Gideon versus Wainwright. If you're on trial for a crime and you have any chance of going to jail at all, you have a right to a lawyer in assistance of your trial. You cannot be put in jail for a crime without a trial or a lawyer. Miranda is when someone is arrested, they have to be read their rights. The idea being that people under arrest are stressed out and can't properly remember what all their rights are. Nixon wins in 1972 because the Democrats can't get it together again. The war just gets worse. The Arabs cut off oil from the United States. Things just go to complete disaster in 1970 to 1974, 75.